of the Board of Education in public for purpose done to the school's business and is not to be considered a public meeting. There is time for public participation during the meeting as indicated in the agenda below. Upon request, superintendent of the district shall make reasonable accommodation for a person with disability to be able to participate in this meeting. This is our board workshop. So I would call our board workshop to order. Would you like to do the roll call? Mr. Albright. Mr. Arnold. Mrs. Bruderly here. Mrs. Greatorex here. Ms. Angus here. Mr. Lundy here. Mrs. Herrera, I'm here. Moving on to our next item is the approval of our agenda.
I move that the agenda be approved as presented.
I'll second. It's been moved and seconded to approve the agenda as presented. Is there any discussion? Hearing no discussion, put this to a vote. All those in favor of approving the agenda say aye. Aye. Any opposed say nay. The agenda has been approved. Our next item is the Board of Education recognition.
Too many buttons. So it is board recognition month, part of your recognition, but you got one off. Yeah. Came back to that. Right interval. Have a short video.
I think the school board helps keep the schools on track and keep the budgets. It helps have this helps make sure they have money. The school board does a lot of stuff. Provide school supplies, make sure Thanks. The school board does for the schools. The school board decides if we have snow days or not. The school board helps solve problems that occur in Dexter. The school board provides a nice learning community, helps us with learning spaces, that gives us our supplies to help have a good learning space. Thank you! We appreciate you!
I'm not sure 3 years ago.
We got together. Did you do that?
Melanie and I did it, but Melanie did the lion's share. McIntyre. But the idea was to recognize what you do, and I know you guys know you do all of that stuff, but we also want the community to understand.
Yeah, it's great.
So,
Thank
you.
Yeah.
And thank you for all the time you put in. I'm so glad you're going to go on vacation. There are staff classroom and something from the high school.
there's a small poster from Creekside and there's a big poster from Deck and
Here's so yeah, buildings.
then building makes some gifts.
Thank you. Yeah, very nice. Set up your pictures in the sock. I'm super excited about the socks. I know. I can't wait to read the socks.
They shrink things.
That's good. These socks. Next on the agenda is public participation. Each speaker is allowed a maximum of 5 minutes for a total of 30 minutes, unless otherwise notified. At this point in the meeting, those interested in making public comment will be asked to raise their hands so the time may be divided equally. Each speaker will be asked to announce their name and district of residence and indicate if they represent any organization or agency. No person may speak more than once on the same subject during a single meeting, nor yield their time to another speaker. The board does not respond to comments during the meeting. Those wishing to receive personal response from the board or superintendent must complete a public comment form as available at the meeting entrance and on our website. And I didn't go through my full spiel here because there's not anybody sitting there, but I could go through this, but as always, common courtesy, please. Is there anyone who would like to stand up for public participation? So, no one but staff and or guests that we know of. And move on to our consent items. We have personnel consent items, new hires, request for leave and resignation. All of those have been provided for us in our package.
I move that the Board of Education approve the consent items.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. Is there any discussion?
I just want to add one of the hires on here started that para teacher program is a para teacher.
Awesome.
Yes.
Great. All right, it's been moved and seconded. Is there any other discussion? All those in favor of accepting the consent items in full, say aye. Aye. Any opposed, say nay. Right, move on to our action items. The first action item is the Alred Stadium synthetic turf. Mr. McCollum.
Hello, everyone.
Hello.
More projects. All right, so the first one I believe in your board agenda. So we move forward with the project. Yeah, I was gonna say, I thought there was supposed to be something else.
Sorry, so, motion. Sorry. I moved that we.
I move that, we want to interrupt.
Go for it.
Alred one?
Yeah.
I move that the Board of Education award the Alred Stadium running track participation project. No, strike that. I move that the Board of Education for the Alred Stadium synthetic turf project. AstroTurf Great Lakes for a base bid of $627,650. With alternate number 2 for $28,049. Alternate number 3, $17,012, plus a 15% contingency of $100,951 for a project total of $773,575.
Have a second.
It's been moved and seconded. Is there any discussion?
We put in, there was a total price we put out there. We put it in. It is, when you add it up, it is, there's also contingency in, yes,
Second.
yes, as well.
Motion, that's the way the motion reads is back.
Well, the other motions for the track. So
I understand, but I thought we wanted to have a 50% contingency on the two of them together, so the same parcel. And there's be some interaction, just more flexibility, you can make 50% on the total of the two instead of individually designated.
So you're asking them that, you're saying, you're
I
trying to
I
clarify. what we
I
want.
think what we really want to do is put the two together, 50% contingency on the two.
It would have to be one giant.
That's not.
we have to award the bids to the.
Anyway, I think that provides more flexibility, and that was what that's the recommendation.
It's 20 grand towards the track. The contingency.
Is it the same?
We should be
Is it
all right.
the same?
Well, it just, it maybe doesn't matter, but it just it provides flexibility. When we talk about it, we try to have maximum flexibility, total dollars, and not have to worry about what's allocated to one piece of the other.
I think if you did a contract.
You did the
If you do
contract.
3
The
motions,
contingency is with the board, not with the contract.
if you do 2 motions to approve the 2 about the
But
contingency
if
and
you
third
do each one
motion,
individually, then we do one motion for 50% on the two together.
that's what I was thinking is most
So the
correct.
contract should with the supplier and contingency is managed by the board.
So why don't we do the 2 motions that are written, the third motion?
That'll be fine.
Says the contingencies are.
What would it be?
No.
Yeah,
Have to
that'll
take
work.
out the 15.
That'll work.
But we do.
122,494.
He's got it. You gotta remove that tip sheet. Yeah. So they'll be added.
That's the correct.
Yes.
So we need a revised motion.
Yeah, just.
It's Brian's
remove the
motion, so.
contingency.
All right, so striking the first motion. New motion, I move that the Board of Education for the Alred Stadium synthetic turf project, AstroTurf Great Lakes, for a base bid of $627,650, with alternate number 2 for $28,049, number 3 for $17,012. Period.
I will second that motion.
It's been moved and seconded. Any further discussion?
Well, I know facilities talked about it, but I wouldn't mind a overview for those of us who weren't privy to the conversation.
No worries. So we put out for bid on January 9th, have the replacement of our Alred synthetic turf field. That bid, bids came in on the 24th. So we submitted them through the state bids. They went to over 200, and the emails went and sent out. When the bid came back, we only got one bid for our turf. It was the AstroTurf Great Lakes. They are a company that has local ties right here to Dexter. So how they wrote into our bid, all the parts of having the design of the field. When we put the design out, we talked to all, Mike Babineau, the athletic director, Chris, we talked to all the coaches about the lines, the design of the field, the way it needs to be. So the project came up with, there was 3 alternates that we put on exactly for the turf field itself. Besides the turf, there was a shock pad. There was the nailer boards around the edge of it. And there was also an alternate bid to replace the goalpost, which has been there since the field was built. And there was a look at recentering the field as well. I don't know if you've ever noticed, if you stand at the center of the bleachers, the field is not centered on the bleachers, if that matters. So one of the things we have to look at is not only with the new goalpost is making sure the ends, because as soon as you center the field, the netting for all the field hockeys then are off. So that's part of it, to put a new goalpost in place.
So we're put in the same spot.
Right, we're gonna put them back in. We're not going to, we're just gonna, yeah, we're not gonna, we'll put our field right back in the same spot. That saves having to move all the posts with the field hockey. It's just getting into it.
Poster, let's do a little bit of oxidation, see the base. We have it.
So
When you-
for those people who are paying attention, they'll know you want to sit on a certain side if you really want to be.
Get a little bit more access to the field. But yeah, so everything, as far as writing in the contract as well, the turf when it was removed, we get first dibs at the turf. If we want to do something else with the used turf around the district. As far as the replacement repairs, there's a long-term warranty program for it. There is a maintenance and care program too.
Great, I had a question. Yeah. Well, this is years ago, but there's some debate about the health, mental health aspects of AstroTurf. I don't know, is there been any further discussion or you have that?
Yeah.
We have had lots of discussions, so I guess I would know there's lots of different things, whether it's to infill the materials, whether it's the safety of athletes on their legs, how that works as well, between grass and with turf. We had a long conversation about that facilities, our committee about how it works. A lot of it is design of athletes turning. The gentleman who is part of AstroTurf, he's on committees that I had some conversations with around safety of fields and turf. So we did have that discussion. We've gone away from the grass fields. Part of it was confused. So, yeah, so we did have conversations about all that, about the safety of fields.
There were concerns for the person. This model, the little ends shouldn't fly out quite as much. It's got.
As they're getting better, one of some of the things of infill, some schools have gone to like a coconut infill, I think is what they're saying. What they find though with some of those, it's in weather, kind of like towards the end of the season, when the rain and it gets in and it freezes, it actually freezes the field more solid and almost makes it more of like a skating rink, rather than the infill, the rubberized pellet infill. So there's different pieces of parts that advantages to it or not. Yep.
But this model of turf they've modified it, but it has like that partial netting in the bottom. that holds it.
So it's, I forget specifically the name of the turf that's in there, but it has all the best. It's got a mesh at the bottom. It's also got the fibers are kind of a split fiber and a woven fiber. It's a blend. It's what they're calling. A lot of schools are going to blend to help with the reduction of
Have
injury.
there been any cases against like this regarding safety? Is there any law, is there any precedent that you're aware of the
That I'm not that
distance? Yeah. Health hazards related.
this specific turf that was in, no, nothing. I can go back and look.
The other good news, census, expect 10 years off.
It's the same company. We'll have the middle of shit.
Yep. So we'll have the equipment to, not only the equipment to help take care of it and maintain it, also within the contractors or the company will come out and use their specified equipment as well to sanitize the field, groom the field, maintain it. Every year, yearly. So they'll yearly come out with their equipment, sanitize and take care of it, and they'll leave equipment here that is part of the bid that is ours, so we can maintain it and take care of it ourselves as well. with training that comes with our staff.
We'll put it to a vote on roll call.
Mr. Albright. Mr. Arnold. Mrs. Brutterly. Aye. Mrs. Greatorex.
Aye.
Ms. Angus. Aye. Mr. Lundy.
Yes.
Where? Aye.
It's been moved. We'll move on to our second action item, the Red Stadium running track renovations, bid category 32-2. Our packet included a bid tally and recommendation letter for operations credit to follow regarding repairs to this track at Red. Facilities Committee met January 24th to review the bids and have recommended the following.
I move that the Board of Education award the Alred Stadium running track renovations project to Goddard Waits Company for a base bid of $135,550 and an alternate number 4 of $8,400.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. Is there any discussion? Craig, you want to fill up the?
So again, part of that, we want to layer in projects, right? We need to have our track, and then after looking at it, our track is in really good shape. So it wasn't a repair, and tear it all out, and replace it all. It's more of a spray coating to redo it, paint the new lines on. MHSA came out with new lines. Then we wanted to layer them in together, right? And I should have said that before. The turf company has assured me that graduation happens if it's on the Red Stadium on that Friday, Saturday, Sunday, whatever it is. Monday, they're here to take the turf out. So they'll be ready to go. And as soon as we have it layered in, that they should be done mid-July. So that is when the track company will come in and get it going. So we wanted to layer those projects in, again, making sure we're taking care of our turf, that one happens before the other. So same bids, we had 3 companies put in bids for our turf, the track renovation, Bain Sports, Star Track, and Goddard. They were all qualified bids. The lowest bid was Goddard Coatings. We had a conversation, so Brian Barrett from Beck Raiders sat with me, not only with the turf, but also with the track companies to make sure the spray and what we were getting meets all of our qualifications and specifications. So the track will be, the main track will be all resprayed. They'll also be filled in with all the new lines. There is the spot by the flagpole to give that consistent look. That'll also be the track material filled in rather than just sprayed concrete. They are also going out to the field events. So they are repairing and respraying all the high jump area to make sure it works. There's some marks on it where it got torn up, so they'll fix and repair all those, spray coat them. And then the alternate bid, that the first bid was to just fix the spot on the running lanes for pole vault, long jump. But the alternate board moving forward with the facility committee was just to replace those, the whole strip. We'll put in new boards, respray them, and get them set.
Are there any questions or discussion? Put it to a roll call vote.
Mr. Albright.
Aye.
Mr. Arnold.
Aye.
Mrs. Brutterly. Aye. Mrs. Greatorex.
Yes.
Ms. Kangas. Aye. Mr. Lundy.
Swear aye. And then our really added third item is to add the 15% contingency to the total project.
I'll move to add 15% contingency to both the turf and the track projects, which include the alternate pricing, which also are already adapted to the alternate pricing. Based on the calculations that slide to me, that would be $122,493. That's on the base bid plus alternates.
It's been moved and seconded. Is there any discussion?
Just a comment, the range of the total contingency slightly under set aside. So it wasn't really surprising these days.
We shouldn't say it until it happens.
So I had one question, it was just looking up quickly, and Daniel pointed me to a type of turf that we're installing. Do you know, is this do you know if it's,
It's what?
is it, do you know what type of turf it is?
Yeah, is it lead free? It is, I have to go look, it's in my office, I can go get you the sample, it's the 3D AstroTurf 3D blend. I have to look specifically. I'm sorry, I have that full. I can get you specifically the makeup and design. Like,
So right now the contingency is on the table. The contingency that it had. Then we can find.
it's not.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't.
There's a brand that says it's environmental friendly, et cetera. So I'm just curious.
One bit of it.
Yeah, yeah. Whatever. Okay.
Question.
Right, the actual specification.
All the questions.
Roll call vote. Mr. Alberry. Mr. Arnold.
Aye.
Burley. Aye. Fraser. Aye. Ms. Angus. Angus.
The type of it's 3D3 root zone is the one that's going in there. I don't see here, so you're asking here about the 3D3 blend, yep, 3D3 root zone.
It's that was already approved. Yeah, that one's already approved. But the discussion passed on that, so it's we're voting on the 15% efficiency. I think the vote was, it's all that it's always,
Lead content is less than 50 ppm.
let's just keep it the vote, please. Install that in this case. It says for 15%, whether or not 15% is critical or not.
You already had a second.
No, we're waiting for Jennifer to say yes or no on it.
I understand that we don't have. It's hard to do. I guess I'll say yes. I would like to know that. Mr. Lundy.
Yes.
Ms. Aguirre.
Yes. Yes.
All right, we move on to our next item on the agenda. Which is our Title IX.
I'd like to introduce Kathleen Doctor from True Law to conduct the formal Title IX workshop. There have been a lot of changes to Title IX over the years, and it's going to change again. But it's important to have all staff, our administrators are all been trained, and we have to have board members trained so they understand the most current law and guidance of the rules. And walk us through.
Okay, good evening, members of the board, superintendent. I don't have a clicker, so I guess I will count on you.
I can bring you my laptop.
Oh, well, I could probably stand, does that work?
That's just.
No, that's just. Okay.
As you see fit.
Okay. All right, wonderful, thank you. All right, so I have a lot more here than you actually have to know, but it's fascinating and fabulous what I do. So we'll kind of skip through some of it, but if you have questions, I encourage you to just ask me because, it's more interesting that way for me. You. This is our cautionary slide, which we always say, this is not legal advice. If you need legal advice, call your legal counsel. Okay, all right. Title IX sexual harassment overview. So Title IX has been around 50 years. I know this because they were born the same year I was. It's been around 50 years. It's always prohibited discrimination on the basis of sex, right? That's the whole point of it. Discrimination on the basis of sex in federally funded educational programs. When Title IX was enacted, sexual harassment is kind of that like Obviously, it was happening, but was it recognized under the law? So there were no regulations about sexual harassment in Title IX. There were Title IX regulations, but there were no regulations about sexual harassment. Well, the Department of Education went full throttle, and in May of 2020, who knew there was going to be a pandemic? But in May of 2020, they came out with their regulation on sexual harassment. Now, Title VII governs employment. And the Title VII employment regulations on sexual harassment are like 16 or 17 lines long. This is like 15 or 16 pages. So they took this very seriously. It went into effect in August of 2020. We had a few other things we were worried about in August 2020, but we all tried to get it, get it up and running and get everybody up to speed. I am not going to talk to you about the pieces of Title IX that prohibit more generally sex discrimination. You all know that, right? Don't build a bathroom for the boys that has a sauna and put the girls in a closet, right? We know. So this is really only going to be about the sexual harassment regulations, with the caveat that there's been a notice of proposed rulemaking, the time for comment has already passed. At any point, most likely, I think sometime in May, we'll get new regulations. And we'll come back and have to tell you all over again what's new. One of the things that I think is going to happen is right now, all of these things I'm going to talk about only apply to sexual harassment. So you can move forward on a more general gender discrimination complaint without using all of these procedures. And I think they're going to extend it to the proposed rule extends these protections to all Title IX complaints. So stay tuned. Okay, so kind of sexual harassment under Title IX applies to basically any interaction that can happen in the school setting. So staff to staff, though that's also going to be covered by another law, Title VII. Staff to student, student to staff, also going to be covered by Title VII, and student to student. Only against persons who are in the United States. Well, that would seem to make sense, the school districts in the United States, but now that we are back to travel, if sexual harassment is alleged to have occurred, say on one of those 17 countries in 6 days trips, that would not be Title IX sexual harassment. So just to keep in mind that, yes, you could still deal with people who engage in bad behavior, but it wouldn't be under Title IX. What?
So we did a student trip
Outside of school, student trip or outside of school calendar or non-sponsored school function.
Outside of the United States, Title IX does not apply.
So it's a school, it was a school sponsored function.
If it doesn't matter what it is, it could be a teacher taking, a class and it's a school, did your tax credit money and you went and, yeah, no, it's Title IX.
That's an example, because the prep for outside.
Because their sexual violation Title IX, yeah.
Teacher, sexual harassment student, school sponsored trip during the school year, or wherever. They come back and the student reports it, it's not sexual harassment.
No, it's not Title IX. Yes, but
still be sexual harassment.
in some ways,
Fired.
No,
yeah, it just takes it out of this realm. So some terms that you'll hear me use: complainant, that's the alleged victim, respondent, grievance process. The recipient is us, the institution that receives federal money. And we'll talk a bit about supportive measures, or maybe we won't, but it's a big part of these new regulations, something that we more typically call interim measures, but they've attached this sort of new phrase to it, supportive measures. Now, I told you there were no Title IX sexual harassment regulations, so how could there be changes? Well, though there were no regulations, there was guidance from the Office for Civil Rights and the U.S. Department of Education, basically telling us how we needed to address sexual harassment under Title IX. What's the problem with guidance from any federal agency? It can change when administrations change. So if you actually trace the history, you'll see, key guidance coming out, and then the Trump administration actually pulled back most of the guidances that had come out, 8 years before. Regulation is as set in stone as it can be, because it takes this whole rulemaking process to change. So even though we dealt with sexual harassment before, we didn't have these elements. A huge change, and this is so critical, is that every school employee has the obligation to report if they believe sexual harassment is happening. And the reason for that is because every school employee having knowledge will impute that liability to the district. So in the past, before these regulations, it had to be someone like a principal or a superintendent. It had to be someone with authority who had the knowledge. Now, if the 2-hour-a-day paraprofessional lunchroom monitor has knowledge, the district will be considered to have had knowledge. So it kind of ups the game on how we train staff. We don't want to dive in too deep, but just enough for them to know if these kinds of things come to you, you need to report them and where to report them.
That is essentially the same.
What's that?
That is essentially the same.
Exactly. So we're already doing mandatory reporting type training. Now you have to add this in. And who knows what might happen, but I don't think that will change.
Is that okay?
I'm sorry?
Is that okay?
Yes, yes.
That's why you were being.
Yes. The single investigator model was eliminated. I actually think this will change. And there's lots of good reasons. And there's, I don't know, 22,000 pages of preamble or something you can go and read, and they'll talk about why they did this. Essentially, this means that we have to have a Title IX team, what I call a team, who can be switched in and out of positions, because if I'm the investigator, I cannot be the decision maker. The Title IX coordinator can be an investigator, but can never be a decision maker. That's not right. There's a lot of procedure in this regulation. It is designed to protect or to provide due process. Of course, if you're procedure heavy, you have many opportunities to fail, right? There are many opportunities to miss a deadline, to forget a step, things like that. And so that is, while I understand the intent, that is kind of the hardship that is created for particularly K-12 institutions, who don't have usually a full-time dedicated Title IX coordinator who doesn't have to do anything else. So, okay, the respondent is presumed not responsible until a responsibility determination is made. I hope that was always true, but it is pervasive through these regulations. There's some additional policy training documentation requirements. You've got this covered, I think. You've had the training on that. These regulations, in my view, were designed to essentially do three things. Essentially raise the bar on what is sexual harassment, what would be considered sexual harassment, while simultaneously making sure that there is a protection, a sort of social safety net, almost, if you want to call it that, for people who believe they've experienced sexual harassment. It might not rise to that definition and be legal sexual harassment, but we're still going to provide something to those students or those staff members or those visitors who can then be able to access the programs and activities of the school. These regulations very expressly are designed to protect First Amendment rights. There was a big push at that point to kind of, I think, reel it back in to say, hey, you know what, you make a joke, you make a whatever, it might be totally inappropriate, you might need to learn not to do that, but it's not sexual harassment. And then the third sort of overarching theme is that we have trained, non-biased teams to go out and do these, enact these procedures. I think anybody who works with Title IX will tell you that there really should be separate regulations for K-12, maybe even K-8, and then post-secondary, right? Do we have a trained non-biased team that can address allegations of sexual harassment? Of course we do. In between teaching fourth grade and in between discipline and everything else. So it's a system that is onerous, frankly, for K-12 districts. Okay, key Title IX roles, we've already talked about several of them. These are the people you have to have in order to affect these regulations. The only optional one is informal resolution facilitator. No institution has to offer informal resolution. So I believe you do. I believe it's in your policy as an option. So if you do offer it, then that facilitator has to be trained. Okay, so to the meat of the matter, what is sexual harassment? And this is a new, well, the Department of Education in 2020 would have said it's not a new definition, but it is a new definition for us. It is not the definition that we were enforcing previously. So sexual harassment under the current Title IX regulations has three parts, and you only have to have one to have violated or to have engaged in sexual harassment, let's say. The first is what we would call a quid pro quo, and it only applies to respondents who are school employees. A student cannot be guilty of this first crime, and that is your, sort of worst case scenario of teacher or some other staff member demands something in exchange for something else, and that something is unwelcome sexual conduct. Now, the unwelcome piece, when you have adults together, that unwelcome piece can be really complicated. For most of our students, unwelcome is built in, right? They're not. They might tell you, and I've had it many times. I was really enjoying that relationship. Yeah, but she's your teacher and you're a student, so it's unwelcome. Okay. So fortunately, we don't see that too often. Obviously, if you see that, it triggers your mandatory reporting and all kinds of other obligations as well. Prong 2 is the far more complicated and far more common, and that's what we would call in sort of other circles the hostile environment prong. And this is where the definition is distinctly different. It has to be unwelcome conduct that a reasonable person, that reasonable person being the person who's experiencing it, would find to be so severe, pervasive, and objectively offensive that it effectively denies a person equal access. Okay, that's a lot of loaded terms. I know we have some lawyers on the board, so you're used to reading these. Previously, the standard was severe or pervasive. Huge difference, right? Change that one word out and you have a whole different ballgame. So this prong, frankly, more often occurs in my experience over the last couple of years of doing this between students, right? Student on student. So you're going to have a lot of questions. Is it unwelcome? I don't know. That's something the investigators are going to have to find out. Was it so severe, pervasive, and objectively offensive that the student who experienced it could no longer access their education on an equal basis? And was it in the education program or activity? Lots of questions with that one. And then the third one, they sort of carved out what I would call sexual harassment that involves violence. So all of these have a definition. They're in here. I'm not going to go through them, but they are all linked to federal law. So they're all definitions provided by federal law. So quid pro quo, we talked about that. Oh, and by the way, if you have a quid pro quo situation in which an employee is the respondent, obviously you cannot do informal resolution. If you have a prong 2 or a prong 3, and the respondent is an employee, you cannot do informal resolution. So we never put a student in a situation of, sort of negotiating or working with someone in that much more power than they have. Okay, so we talked about this. Denial of equal access. So what does that mean? I think the key takeaway to denial of equal access is that it doesn't have to be you failed out of school. It doesn't have to be you stopped coming to school. It can absolutely be that you were so excited to take that AP psychology class next year and it just couldn't wait. And then this happened, and that the student is going to be in that class, and now you don't take it. So it's really anything. It's not meant to be a high bar. There are a lot of high bars in these regulations. This is not necessarily meant to be one of them. One of the examples they used in the preamble was a 3rd grader who started wetting the bed. And they said, okay, that was, a denial of equal access because he had this physical manifestation of the stress caused by what he had experienced or believed he had experienced. Here's our sexual violence definitions. The only thing I want to point out is that sexual assault can include forcible fondling. And in the 2.5 years or so that I've been doing these under these regulations, forcible fondling has come up a lot. Because if it moves to prong 2 and it's that hostile environment, it has to be severe and pervasive. Well, one time of groping someone is frankly under the law not severe and pervasive. But if it can meet that federal definition of forcible fondling, then we can get at it that direction. And unfortunately, we actually see a lot of that. Okay. Never had a dating violence or a stalking case. Not to say they're not out there, but I haven't seen one. Consent is an important term. Your investigators and your decision makers need to know how the district defines consent. The regulations do not provide us a definition, do not say this has to be the definition. So whatever our definition of consent is, that's what they need to look at. Okay, let's see here. Yeah, obviously, consent is irrelevant with an employee and student. All right, so there's the definition. And I'll tell you, when I do these trainings, historically, I've usually done the definition of sexual harassment much further down, because there's so much to this before you ever get to a real consideration of whether sexual harassment occurred. But for your purposes and it's short on time, I wanted to make sure you had it. So let's go back to what I would normally talk about first, which is how does the school district violate Title IX? Well, it violates Title IX under these regulations where it has actual knowledge of an allegation of sexual harassment experienced by an individual in the education program, and the district acts with deliberate indifference. So the regulations recognize that we can't stop all sexual harassment, right? Just like we can't stop all, slurs that we would prefer not being used. The issue for us is, what do we do when we become aware that it has happened? So we're going to unpack each of those terms. What is actual knowledge? Again, this is a huge change. It is notice to any employee. And it's not written notice, it's not formal, hey, magic word notice. It is one example that I was using was, a student comes to a teacher, or fortunately, even counselor, and says, yeah, Sally, my best friend Sally, she's really upset because so-and-so has, photoshopped her picture in art class onto a naked, all this kind of stuff. Sally didn't come to us, but this friend came to somebody. Maybe it was a teacher, maybe it was her bus driver. She's got a long ride, talks to her bus driver. That gives us notice, which means we now have actual knowledge. Which again is why it's so important that we have a way to get that knowledge from whoever obtained it to the Title IX coordinator who needs to have it. Obviously witnessing something that could be sexual harassment, again, what we want to emphasize with staff is it's not for you to decide whether it was sexual harassment, but if it meets sort of these parameters, it needs to be reported. Okay. We've talked about that. So we had actual knowledge of an allegation of sexual harassment by an individual in the education program or activity. So what do we mean by education program or activity? You've been disciplined for the last many years. You know this comes up all the time. This district is only responsible for sexual harassment that occurs in a location, event, or circumstance over which the school exerts substantial control over the alleged respondent and the context in which it happened. So the weekend, that's what we had, the weekend family trip of two families who are good friends to, their mountain cabin. I come from Arizona, so lots of mountains there. Their mountain cabin, and sexual harassment occurs. Not ours. It's just not. We didn't control that circumstance, so we can't have any liability related to it. Except that if then it comes back and perpetuates or manifests in some way in school, then it might be ours. In other words, then there are threats sent over school, during school, over school equipment. If you tell anyone, I will, I'll make sure that everyone knows you're of whatever, right? Then it might become ours, but that actual act cannot be ours because we had no control. So off campus, kind of what we just talked about, it's not a matter of location, it's a matter of control. It's a matter of context. So yes, the school's going on one of these trips out of the country and the sexual harassment occurs in the airport. Here in this country, we were exerting control. So that would be ours. Okay. Actual knowledge, educational program or activity, and then that last key piece is that the district reacts with deliberate indifference. So what does that mean? One of the three phrases that basically allows, allows agencies to kind of review everything we do. And the standard is that it is a response to notice of sexual harassment. Important part, important note, not actual sexual harassment, that notice piece. Response to notice of sexual harassment that is clearly unreasonable in light of the known circumstances. So I don't know, we have to see over time, except they're going to change. But so we have to see over time. What does the Office for Civil Rights and courts call clearly unreasonable? But there are some things we know we can do to avoid being clearly unreasonable. The most important of which is to adopt, which you have, and implement the grievance policy that meets the requirements of the regulation. That is step number one. That's the first thing they would look at. Do you have a policy? Does it meet the requirements of the regulation? The answer is no. It'll be found to be deliberate. Okay. So what happens when that notice makes its way to the Title IX coordinator? Now, it can have intermediary steps, right? Like I wouldn't necessarily say to every employee you need to report to the Title IX coordinator, but at some point, relatively quickly, it needs to get to the Title IX coordinator, who then must do, it's not optional, must do three things. Must call or somehow talk to the alleged victim, who's not a complainant yet, and his or her family, because he or she's probably a minor, about three things critically important. At this point, there's been no determination of sexual harassment happened. There really, it shouldn't matter if there's a whiff, then it might be one of those three things on the definition, then this should happen. Contact the complainant to discuss supportive measures. So we'll talk about what those are, but supportive measures are offered regardless of whether a formal complaint is filed. And frankly, in the end, whether or not, you know, a respondent is determined to have committed sexual harassment. Supportive measures can be offered to anyone in the process, including respondents. But that initial conversation is with the complainant. Sometimes that call will be the first time parents know about it. Many times it'll be parents who brought it to the attention, right? So they already know. As I said, supportive measures are available regardless of whether they file a formal complaint, and that call or that conversation has to include the process for filing a formal complaint. The formal complaint has to be written and it has to be signed. I believe you have a form. You wouldn't want to reject one because it wasn't on the form, but it's very helpful to sort of say to someone, here's a form, no one can help you fill it out, whatever they need. But you do need that, conversation to happen. And all of that has to happen, and here's when I do this, when I do presentations to principals, where I feel like I might get, in a lot of trouble. This all has to happen before anyone gets disciplined for behavior that might be sexual harassment. Somebody comes in after lunch and says, Sally Grab, Sally whatever. What we can't do is pull Sally down, interview everybody, issue discipline, send Sally home, and then think, oh, that might be Title IX. Because now we've determined that Sally was a sexual harasser without going through this process. Does it make any sense in terms of how you govern or control or educate on the ground? Like, we know that. But that's what it is. And then I will tell you 8 times out of 10, when the call comes, some degree of investigation and discipline is almost always already occurred. So far, haven't gotten dinged, but we just, it's a whole new mindset for building administrators, because they're good at discipline, right? Like, they're good at getting to the bottom of what happened and dealing with it quickly. This system is not designed to be.
It's not designed to provide a safe environment for.
That's where supportive measures should come in. Supportive measures can be things like separating 2 students, taking a student out of, a teacher's class if it's the allegation against the teacher. Obviously, the staff is going to sort of look at, do we think if there's even a possibility of merit? But I've had many situations where, everybody's pretty much like, no, this is a slow bit against this teacher, right? So we're not going to necessarily send the teacher home, but we're going to separate them and we're going to do a full investigation and see what happens. So supportive measures can be anything. Do anything with disability law, the accommodation process. The world is your oyster. It can be anything as long as it's non-disciplinary and non-punitive to either party. Now, when I say non-punitive, it can't unreasonably burden. So it can burden someone. So say two kiddos are in the same math class. One of them has to be moved. Yeah, that's a burden for whatever reason, but it's not an unreasonable burden so long as they're in an uncomparable math class. Now, if they're both in the only AP physics class and one of them has a scholarship to MIT and really needs to complete this class, okay, then moving that student might become an unreasonable burden. It's fact specific. But that's what your Title IX coordinator has to sort out. You don't have to. Okay, so I'm going to skip through. Respondent removal is a hot button issue. We get a lot of calls where people say, well, we need to remove the student, the accused. We need to remove. No, you don't. You don't need to remove that student unless there is a imminent threat of physical harm to someone, the student, staff, another student. Physical harm, not psychological. So the fact that someone might have to sit, in the same hallway or same room as someone who they believe has sexually harassed them, and they're anxious and upset does not trigger a removal. So be really careful. Encourage administrators to be really careful about that. The exception is employees. You can remove employees. And then of course, all of the Michigan specific laws kick in. Obviously, if you want paid leave, don't want unpaid leave, things like that. Okay. Now, in many situations, the process sort of stops there. The district had notice, had a link for you to call, talk to the family, develop some supportive measures, and the family says, "I don't want to file it. You don't want to file a formal complaint." Maybe they read the policy and said, "Oh no, that sounds good." But whatever it is, we give them essentially that decision-making power with a couple of exceptions, because Title IX coordinator can find a complaint and initiate a formal complaint, but we really only want to do that where we believe there's some other reason that the family is not willing to sign. So I had this happen in Arizona, someone who was not there legally, like putting our name on that, doing anything, we're not, and then the question becomes, is the behavior that's been alleged severe enough that we would be deliberately indifferent if we don't sign it? And what I always tell my clients is, rule of thumb, if it's going to make the news when someone finds out about it, sign it. If the entire football team is engaged in some sort of hazing activity, sign a complaint. But if it's two sixth graders and parents say, nope, you know what, we feel like it's been dealt with, we're good, okay, don't sign the complaint. You do not do an investigation into Title IX sexual harassment unless you have a formal complaint, period. Hard stop.
So what's the timeline for parents deciding?
Yeah.
So you still can't
Yeah. Now, I will tell you, practically speaking, I have always told my clients, you have the conversation. If they say to you, well, let me think about it, okay, let them think about it. If they say to you, nope, not filing a complaint, then move forward with your other process. If they say no, and you believe they're not going to, and you move forward with discipline under something other than sexual harassment, like disorderly conduct or, whatever the behavior fits, and they come back and file one, well, okay. I mean, take it and go from there. I have not had that happen yet, but it's a really good.
Say parent. They don't want to follow the plan. They definitely believe in sexual harassment. They made the process and supportive measures. It's there, but still want to plan. They, especially parents, sign something saying that they really not done good, we'll put the process spread out. They sign something.
What are we done wrong? Right? Quick confirmation.
But in the end, the kid actually was sexually harassed.
What's that?
So if they didn't file, if they wouldn't be able to sign off and they didn't want to file, when we still had to investigate. In case if it was sexual harassment, we would have had an assault, the parent can't sign off. Not follow the investigation.
If the allegation is something like sexual assault and a parent won't sign, then I would. That's a serious allegation. And I actually did. I had that. I had a situation where I'm not even kidding you. Mom was basically like, yeah, well, she just has to learn. And we decided, no, she really didn't just have to learn to deal with that. So we signed the complaint. And of course, if the student is above 18, they get to decide. Parents don't decide. So, but to answer your question, there's no formal form for them to sign, but I would absolutely have the Title IX coordinator send me an email. Please confirm my understanding that, and all documents related to Title IX have to be saved for 7 years. So that goes in the file and gets saved. Okay, oh, this is also key. Complainant must be participating in or attempting to participate in the school's education program activity at the time they filed a formal complaint. I've got one on my desk right now. Student graduated 7 years ago and has come back to say, I was sexually harassed by this person. Now, in that case, so these regulations can apply, so we're looking at it. But if the complainant is not trying to access our educational program activity, which doesn't necessarily mean being a student, right? It might mean they were getting assigned to do their student teaching there. They were, now parents themselves, and they had a student who was coming here. But for the most part, there's not really going to be anything we can do under Title IX. Of course, if there's an allegation against a teacher, we've got other mechanisms to look into it. Okay. Let's see, I'm just going to skip all of this because you need to know that. The most.
So if the student drops out because of it, or transfers to a different school, wants to file a complaint,
that's a really good question, and I would say that's going to be a fact-specific inquiry. So if parents got transferred to a new job, then no, they're not trying to access. If in fact they're now on an hour-long bus ride, or parent is driving an extra 45 miles to get them to school because this happened, and then I would say yes, they are still trying to access the educational environment. They just had to, or they feel they've had to take a different step. Yeah. Okay. I'm not going to talk about this, but I know you all know this. There would never be an instance where, so I hope anything would come to you that involved photos or videos that you aren't looking at, can't be looking at. Law enforcement involvement, it used to be just absolute on the part of OCR that could not in any way delay our process for law enforcement investigation. I actually pleased with these regulations let us delay briefly. So if there's going to be a confrontation call, or nowadays they're often tests, we can delay, because normally once we get a phone call, we are obligated to provide notice to the respondent if he or she has been accused of something. But so what I always tell administrators is, if officers are involved, or law enforcement's involved, just have a quick call. And 9 times out of 10, they'll be like, no, we're good, we have what we need. But if they want us to delay, we will.
Reality though, is that the police are involved and it's a child, they go to their first interview. Parents of their kids twice.
So
But the departments, the law enforcement generally let us have a transcript of the interviews. The kid does get dragged twice.
So I've had at least one situation where if a complainant refuses to make him or herself available, then we're in a situation where we can do a permissive consult. But if a respondent refuses to participate in our process, well, okay, there's nothing we can do to compel that. And I have had instances where I've gotten a police report, which is not as good as a transcript, but sometimes they're 10 pages long of the back and forth. So if you're lucky enough to have a good law enforcement investigation and you can get that police report, that's a pretty solid piece of your investigation. Okay, so I'm going to skip to, because I know.
Oh, no, you gotta do you do the process of the time.
Yeah, I can do timelines. So
We gotta do time.
timelines.
This is the reality. We can't have this.
Yeah, this is the hard part. Although sometimes I think just taking it out of the hands of lawyers makes it go faster. I got a beautiful report not too long ago that they completely missed the Title IX piece, but they did a beautiful Title IX investigation. They just didn't know that's what they were doing. They did it in like 5 days. So the regulation does not establish a timeline. It says basically that it has to be, you know, reasonably fast or not unreasonably delayed. And it then provides examples of 60 days might be reasonable and 30 school days might be reasonable. And so, yeah. And we'll review your decision on whether or not it was reasonable through the lens of deliberate indifference. Okay. But whatever your policy says, what you should adhere to. And I believe the policy says, what's that?
Sure.
Right. Although I wasn't here when they were written. I was writing the ones in Arizona. So I think it's does it say 60 days? That's what I put in all of mine. Interestingly enough, I have honestly found that 60 days is not enough. It's often not enough. But that's what's there. So what that means is, and I a series of checklists, Title IX coordinator needs to be on it. They have that conversation, they get a formal complaint, that's the day the clock starts ticking. They identify an investigator, they get the complaint to the investigator. They get out the notice letter that I didn't talk about, but it's a big part of what they have to do. Investigator gets on it right away. When I do investigator training, I always say, look at it first and ask for anything that's not interview related first. Ask them to, ask the district to retrieve emails. Ask the district to, surveillance footage. Have it usually on a loop, so you want to get it as quickly as possible. Bus or surveillance footage, whatever it is. Get those things as quickly as you can, or at least put in the request for them. And then start interviewing people. Now, you have to provide written notice of the interview to both parties with enough time for them to prepare to respond. So again, this is what is like completely, in opposition to what school administrators usually do. And frankly, what I did as an investigator for a university, I want them surprised. I don't want them to know what it's about. But the regulations require that they get notice that they're going to be interviewed on this Title IX complaint. Who's going to be there? There's going to be anyone other than the investigator there. When, and the rule of thumb, again, it doesn't tell us how long we have to do them. I usually use the rule of thumb of like 2 days. So if you send it on a Monday, you can interview on Wednesday. But if they call and say, I'm not ready by Wednesday, then you need to let them have time, which is difficult because you have this short timeline to get your investigation done. What's that?
Why did that's not important law? I mean, if they work for school, district, give them time off to gather their information. I mean, I'm assuming the investigator in most cases, not all, someone in the school.
Yeah.
It's usually kid.
Yeah, it really is.
Right, so you have parents, investigation. And I think I'm the one that filing a complaint. Want this problem. I don't want this dragged out. I know sometimes it's gonna be dragged out, but for the user wants to drag it out. For the child, say a child, has to deal with this in school, all the rumors. I mean, 10 days, I would say 2 days are good. Get your parents, what's here, how much more policies, but it should be that quick. Even if it's an after school hours, they come in.
Yeah, I think that
I'm just saying it's not realistic just knowing, and just because of the family lawyer.
Right.
It just keeps going.
Right.
Well,
And I believe me,
that's why I want to make it.
Yeah.
It should be fast forward, it's gonna get, it's gonna get better.
It actually gets worse. Because, so you get the interview, do the interviews with the,
I personally, I would start with the complainant, you want to get the story. And then find out who the complainant thinks you should talk to. Yeah, the witnesses that they feel like you should talk to. As a matter of course, I interview the respondent last unless there's a good reason not to. I will tell you that it is very common for a respondent to refuse. So, I mean, that just is what. But again, going back to that notice, I think 2 days is sufficient unless they call you and say, hey, we're getting Sally a lawyer and we need another week. Well, then you give them another week. Because they need to have time to prepare. So the investigator gathers all of the evidence, and for some cases, that's going to take 1 day after they've sent their notices, and for some cases, it's going to take, a month, just depending on what the volume of evidence is and how many witnesses you have to talk to. Once the investigator has all of the evidence, this is the part that, well, this is one of several parts that kind of blows up educators' hearts, because we have to share all of that evidence with the other part. So an investigator needs to be carefully trained to be thoughtful. Step number one, they need all of the evidence. This is relevant, it's directly related. We need to get it. But with the recognition that, with the exception of medical documentation, maybe a spousal privilege, if you've got an adult going, something like that. With the exception of those things, that's going to get exchanged. So if a parent says to an investigator, oh, and it happened numerous times, he has autism, he doesn't recognize the social cues that indicate that his behavior is unhealthy. That's really important. In my view, that's important. If nothing else, then for what's the punishment? But if they offer you the IEP, well, now that understood it's your IEP. So what we suggest is, hey, okay, talk to us about that. How does the autism manifest? And not necessarily get that document, or get something that's kind of like at a glance, or get a teacher to describe that kind of thing. Because if we have it and it's directly related, it gets shared with both parties. So, again, except for medical information, which you have to have a consent signed to share. Once we have all of the evidence, you send out all of that evidence to both parties and their advisors if they have them. And they have 10 days. So there are these built-in time periods that extend this no matter what. They have 10 days to review the evidence and get back to you with a response. My experience is if it's an unrepresented party, you'll get an email just reiterating everything that's already been said or something could have been said. And if it's a lawyer, you'll get 20 pages of legal argument. So, you just kind of have to balance that. Once the investigator gets that response back, those responses back, then they prepare an investigation report. That investigation report, when it's done, goes to both parties at the same time, goes to the decision maker, and now there's a built-in additional 10 days where the decision maker has to hold and the parties can write questions back and forth. The decision maker decides if they're relevant or not, and that can take more than 10 days if there are questions. I personally almost never see questions. But if there are questions, it can take a little while. So now, you're looking at, I would say you're at minimum 30 days out before a decision maker can review the evidence and make a decision. And 30 days is like 3. Because of these built-in time periods. Okay, so.
So I have a question about that. If it is I think you've got cases in the past where allegations have been made against places. Think that they've been put out in the meeting for a certain period of time. Is that considered? Are we still You still do that.
Yes, you can. You can just, you don't have to, but you are permitted to do so.
Even while all of this is going on,
Yes.
because they're still being paid.
And some of that can be a supportive measure, should be, because if there are allegations against them.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, it's, it's really a difficult situation, but because of course an employee experience that's disciplinary, even though it's not.
And then, so just to, it's like this too, where a student claims this from another student. And we're going through all this process and students are still in school. And nothing's happening. And the parent of the
Complainant.
is obviously upset because they want their child
Yes.
separated from the other students. So
Sometimes it feels like that's, you try the supportive measures.
Mhm.
It just depends on the situation, how you have, and it takes forever to make evidence between the two,
It does.
just makes it worse.
I mean,
In the cases we've had.
at minimum, what I would do is separate them to whatever degree. So, I've represented some districts where there are 8 classrooms, 8 person, or where else for that? So if that's the situation, well, maybe it's an escort in and out, they're seated as far away from each other as possible in the classroom. Is it ideal? Absolutely not. If there's another school that one of them can be moved to, or another classroom in the same school, again, with the don't unreasonably burden issue in mind. So it really has to be kind of a dialogue with the parties about, what does the complainant need? How can we do it? This is where I think you really have to pull in the building administrator, because they're the ones who know what can be done and not done. I can come up with all kinds of ideas, but I don't know how things run.
It was written for hire. So 2 kids in the middle school or high school, and something happens with 2 kids as you investigate, you don't have as many options as you need to really separate. Best you can.
And I mean, I think depending on age, you remind them that retaliation is a separate claim and explain to them what retaliation is. I had a situation where kiddo gets accused by 3 different students independently of the same behavior and immediately starts sending text messages. He wasn't threat, harm, but just coercing, intimidating text messages. Like, okay, well now you just got yourself another problem. So yeah, there's no easy answer. It's a very difficult situation.
Because there's no clear cut definition, subject to individual interpretation, but this person is all kinds of wishy-washy words in there, no matter what you like, you're the challenge. So now you go around in front of us.
I mean, absolutely, right? I always tell people, can they sue me? Well, of course they can sue you. You can sue anybody. Is it a viable one? But what we haven't really seen yet is, there are OCR cases out there, but there aren't a ton of them. And we don't know exactly how they'll come down on some of these things. So over time, we'll have more information. Of course, that varies by field office. It's not supposed to, but it does, So I just want to touch really quickly, because I know it's getting late, on the decision maker's role and then the board's role. The decision maker has to make an independent determination. You want a meaty, really excellent investigation, because that's really all the decision maker is going to have, other than maybe those questions, if any, are exchanged. The decision maker has to evaluate all the evidence and decide whether or not sexual harassment occurred. I've told all of my clients, and I ran a training program in Arizona, and I said, you know what, the investigator is the most important job. The decision maker is the most. because in this structure right now, in many ways, decision makers feel like they're acting impacted. They have what's on this page, and that's it. You can have hearings, but well, don't. That really doesn't. So that decision maker makes that decision, and that is the decision. It can be appealed. There are specific bases on which it can be appealed, and there's a timeline. But what I have seen happen is, let's say there's a determination by the decision maker, yeah, this conduct happened. It happened, and the conduct equals sexual harassment. Lots of times it happens that it doesn't equal sexual harassment. But let's say it did, it happened, conduct equals sexual harassment. Decision maker makes the regulations say the decision maker decides the. Well, we all know that if it's anything over 9 days or 10 days of removal, the decision maker doesn't make the decision, right? They can make a recommendation. So let's say the decision maker makes a recommendation that the student be long-term suspended for the remainder of the school year. Late enough in the year. That is the recommendation set out in the determination. That is going to come to the board most likely, right? The board's role is not to look at the determination and think, oh, I don't think that's the determination I would make, or I want this, or I want that. No, the board is dealing with the fact that a determination that sexual harassment occurred exists. And then, but the role of the board is to decide, is that recommended discipline appropriate? Just like you would in any other discipline matter that comes before you, right? You can accept the recommendation, you can reject the recommendation, you can modify the recommendation. So that's where it's not send it back to the investigator and get more information. You've got to have a well-trained Title IX team, and then you've got to choose. So that's kind of that was my last big statement. I guess the only other thing I would say is to repeat 7 years has to be maintained, all documentation, and the privacy issue is really hard because we cannot disclose this information outside, right? You can't have a press conference, you can't, obviously, that kind of thing. But you have to exchange that information between students. So I created a non-disclosure clause, a non-disclosure agreement. Those are worth the paper they're on, but reiterate to parents they are not, or to students and parents, they are not supposed to disseminate this information more broadly, but they're not subject to it, right? It's not their responsibility. So that causes a lot of heartburn, and I think that they appropriately causes a lot of heartburn. But one thing that we do is when we send out the evidence memos, we put a watermark that we put in a respondent, so that now I'm sure there are off, but hopefully, if something does appear where it shouldn't be, you'll just. Anything else you wanted to touch on?
Is there, so it's not just the, is there a part of the mechanism that they get to ask questions that's before the decision maker?
That's during the decision maker phase, but before the determination, yes.
Part of right, what's the other one? The investigation.
I think that it's tricky in that oftentimes administrators, things come to them well-intended, they start to ask questions, right? They start to ask questions to figure out what actually is going on here. And very quickly they realize, boy, this has the potential to be a Title IX case. And they do a great job.
They realize that.
Ours do. They do a really nice job. But and they'll call Barbara, myself, who serve as the Title IX coordinator, and say, hey, I think we have something going on here. We need to. And then from there, Barbara and I really have to start to work separate. One of us starts to coordinate and make sure that process is being followed. And the other one's kind of kept in the dark for the reasons you've heard. They have to serve as the decision maker, or they're going to have to do some investigations. So we tend to go solo when these things come across.
And a tricky thing I found is that for some of our students, our administrators have already talked to them. They've started to take notes and figure out what's going on. And then we potentially, if it goes to an investigation, we have to initiate that process. And that's hard, right? If students just lived a traumatic experience or potentially traumatic experience to relive that, or we're basing on notes, but we're not having a chance to speak to that student, that doesn't feel good. You want to hear that the students want to have a chance to talk to them. So unfortunately, these situations are uncomfortable. Many of them that come our way are not the most pleasant situations. Luckily, there aren't tons of them. But I think we try our best to do, and we always reach out to legal and make sure that we're following process. We're doing things the right way. I don't know.
I think the other thing is we're learning this process
Yeah.
because it's new and it's complicated. They will reach out and ask us questions. So then that now eliminates both of us sometimes, is holding roles in this because we have too much information. So we've had to reach out to other administrators who are trained to be investigators.
And then there's what inevitably happens between two kids. I end up being the decision maker, but parents are probably angry at me. I don't even know what they're working on because I can't. It's really hard. And everybody's waiting for us to do something about it. And we're not about to.
When do you, what severity do you want and give to law enforcement?
We still
Oh,
have
right.
to-
Like assault, something like that, section assault.
We still have to investigate.
I know, but when do you still
Yeah.
hunt right away? It's a crime. It means that it's not just harassment, me picking on something. It's a crime.
But we punted, but we still have to investigate it.
Anything that would be a mandatory report, you have. That's not, there's no question about that, but yes, then still have to.
So two investigations going on at the same time.
Which is the parents. They're be hitting their notes necessarily. Unless they're going to include the good job given to us, but
It's not fun if you have a row and.
yeah.
But it's, I mean, honestly, a majority of the time, law enforcement. So then. Obviously, if it's something that we're not closing quickly, then it's probably a big deal. And even though we have to continue our investigation, the reality is that is probably the rest of our investigation. So we probably won't, I mean,
But we need to finish the Title IX so we can do this.
absolutely, but you know, in those situations, they might have a lawyer who says don't participate. I would tell my client not to participate. So, you know, then you just have to go on what you have.
I think the other lesson learned for us has been difficult to new language for hostile environment. And really take consideration, is this severe, pervasive, and objectively offensive? That's really tricky to consider, particularly when you talk about younger students, right? When we're talking about 7-year-olds or 8-year-olds in a one-time incident, to be able to say, yes, that meets criteria on all three, and we are going to move forward or not. And then have that conversation with the families that say like, hey, I'm sorry that this happened to your child, but it doesn't quite meet criteria. It's not to say that nothing happened to your child allegedly, or that we're not going to support you and your child, but it doesn't meet criteria for a Title IX.
Well, and in that situation, parents don't know this, but in many ways, it's the jackpot, because in that situation, it gets back for some other, you know, discipline under some other factors. Because 5- and 6-year-olds shouldn't be subject to this, ridiculous, for the most part. So, yeah, I mean, in that situation, then what are you looking at? Horseplay, or you know, whatever you have to look at but you have to remind administration, whatever, how to get sexual harassment. You can't. I had a client who routinely found students to have violated student conduct and sexual harassment in elementary school with the theory that they wanted to sort of teach them a lesson, and that was like hard no once these regulations came out, and it was a mind change. But if the conduct's not sexual harassment, but it actually happened, It's almost always, right? Something else. So. The only other thing I would say is, you know, to remember that is, for now, Title IX coordinator can be an investigator, but not a decision maker and not an appeals officer. Have you had any appeals?
We had one where we made correct decision.
Well, that's because
I don't remember the nuances.
I found that they're not being appealed very often. Or to what appeals officers.
It's, I will say though, yeah, the regulations, I do not believe protect kids. It puts kids in a bad spot, especially at the second level. They are sitting in school, seeing the same person they had, but we could have done. But
Yeah, the pendulum, you know, the Department of Education felt that the pendulum has swung too far to protect plaintiffs and wasn't giving fair due process to respondents. And the goal of these regulations was to move that pendulum back. So, you know, for whatever it's worth, the way that was conceptualized was through due process. And a lot of it, there's a lot of it in this. Any other questions?
Yeah, the retaliation, or for the case. You know, somebody else, sexual harassment, being pretty bad. Investigation goes on, sitting here. One person got maybe harassed, just random people. They take part of themselves. What? Here for 25 days. Came back to spring break. Still sitting in the class before she did. And bullying, side rooms, they're smart. Yeah, I'm sure it happens.
I would say that these regulations are never for K schools and don't protect kids.
I had a situation that I thought was really terrific for plaintiffs. With other students who did not believe the plaintiff should be literally beat the crap out of them. Now, they were punished for that. But the reality is, yeah, it's not, because you can't keep the information confidential. In the past, we wouldn't always tell a respondent who made the accusation. There are definitely pros and cons to that. I can see the department's reasoning and saying, how can you have due process if you don't really know what you're responding to? And I get that.
My biggest problem is the time.
Is the
When
way
you have
of
timelines and you should be able to do support of the terms.
If they're doing police investigation, that's a very much law enforcement. They have school investigations, so you should want it. It's just for law enforcement has not been information that they want to prosecute. So at that point, the person is not guilty yet, but it's going, they've gone information to prosecute. And essentially, can at that point move for their own protection or the reason for fault to the victim.
If it was a charge for sexual assault, we have to start something. You've got to wrap up your investigations.
the
Law.
there's usually two things, juvenile, they're doing
right?
and there's other regulations. Yeah, bond conditions and sorts of things. So it doesn't make the school problem. Because
Well, listen, it happened.
No, I mean, it's a school problem in that we still have to do the Title IX investigation, but we don't, the district doesn't take on the responsibility for removal because Title IX does not give you right.
even if it's contact, no contact order is part of bond relation.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
the no contact orders don't apply. So
Understood.
we got stuck with
And-
trying to navigate. this problem.
Yeah, well,
So
I mean, yeah.
that's when we're out begging for forgiveness and say we're gonna do this. If it means that it's wrong.
And I certainly have.
But that's where it was written for higher ed, because you can't keep some. In a high school or middle school.
It's my personal opinion that there ought to be slightly different regulations within K-12 as well. Or, hey, there isn't prone to hostile environment, sexual harassment, and failure in fourth grade, or something, right? Yeah,
My gosh, it's been like a law school class, Brian and I compare ourselves.
right? It's, there will be a hard. My son is in his last semester of law school, and I just been thinking about, oh, geez, this summer.
Treat it like a job.
Oh,
Just put your time.
what a nightmare.
Just say, I never want to do this again.
I was so happy that when I first got out, Arizona didn't have reciprocity with anyone. By the time, I mean, I practiced in Arizona almost 20 years. By the time I left, they did. I wouldn't do it. I would not do it. You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
All right, so, okay, we'll move on to our second opportunity for participation. Each speaker is allotted maximum 30 minutes for the second opportunity. Is there anyone who wishes to say? No? Okay. Well, at this time, the board begins to session.
I move the Board of Education comes into closed session for the purpose of discussing.
Second.
Been moved and seconded. Any discussion? All those in favor of moving to closed session for 2 minutes. Grudging.
It'll be short, I
I'm
promise.
sorry.
Really high. Mr. Rader.
Yes.
Ms. Kangas. Mr. Bundy.
We're high. Closed session.